Okay, perfect. So I am joining you from Princeton, which is situated on the ancestral land of the Lenape people who were displaced by violent colonial actions that forced their relocation to the north and to the west. I really wish that I could be there with you in person. Thank you, Julia and Erin. I've never been to Australia actually, which feels like a huge gap in my understanding of our world system, but I'm really hoping to be able to make it soon. And I'm just grateful that you were able to accommodate my schedule, and also apologies for being so difficult on email while on sabbatical. Okay, so my reflections are going to be based on a combination of policy work that I did on climate reparations in my former role as Special Rapporteur, UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And then I'm also going to share some reflections that are based on some work, academic work that I've been doing on reparations for colonial injustice, in particular colonial racial injustice as well. So my remarks, it's good that I'm coming after Harjit, who is very much in the climate space. I am not, and who has given you, I think, a very helpful overview, because I think of my contribution as coming more from the reparation side of climate reparations, and then kind of trying to see how the climate debate is situated within the broader global conversations around reparations for colonial racial injustice and colonial injustice more broadly. I also wanted to start by saying that the American Journal of International Law has a symposium issue coming out on reparations, in which some of my reflections that I'm going to share on race and reparations and international law will be included. But more importantly, I'm flagging two articles, one by Anne Orford and another one by Lavanya Rajamani, both of which are on climate reparations. So to the extent that people are interested in more granular reflections on the international law of climate reparations and where the debates are, I think those two articles will be really interesting from that perspective. So in terms of what I'm going to do with my time, I thought I'd start by situating, as I mentioned, climate reparations within a broader project for reparations for colonial injustice, in particular colonial racial injustice. And then I will tie those reflections to just the question of what the project of reparations entails more generally. So how are reparations constructed in international law? How should we be thinking about them beyond what international law does? And then I'll conclude with some thoughts on climate reparations and racial justice in particular. So, notwithstanding the chaos seems too mild a word for what's happening with the international order right now. It seems as though we are in a moment of, or a period of inflection. It's hard to say where things are going. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that there's been growing international momentum calling for reparations for colonial injustice, including the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. So some examples: in 2024, the UN Secretary General publicly called for reparations for the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans as a way to tackle its legacy in today's society, including systemic racism. The Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council, has also made calls for the urgency of reparatory justice for colonialism and the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. And as you all know, even better than me, that we now have this climate change advisory opinion that's before the ICJ. The referral itself makes no mention of colonialism or even racism, doesn't even mention the international treaties that address the prohibition on racial discrimination, but the pleadings by different states and by different groups, including the Organization of African and Caribbean and Pacific States, have made clear that advisory opinion is that the issues in that opinion sit at the heart of problems that are related to unremediated colonial injustice. So I would say that even that climate advisory opinion can be brought into a broader conversation around reparations for colonial injustice that are taking place in different parts of the world. And as many of you will also know, there is at the regional level, in 2023, the Inter-American Court accepted a request for an advisory opinion on the climate emergency and human rights. And when it did so, it actually solicited inputs on colonialism and colonial injustice and how that should be a factor in understanding how it articulates the obligations of states. And so these are just a few. There are many more examples that speak to, I would say, a growing transnational debate for reparations, which is separate from demands that have been made in the domestic, local, regional levels. You know, a country like the United States, where the federal government is utterly resistant to the project of reparations, and there's currently an administration, as you know, that is antagonistic even to racial equality in its most basic forms. Nonetheless, you have at the local and the national, I mean, the local and the regional level, you've seen over, I think the number is more than 500 initiatives, reparations initiatives that have been driven by groups that are not the federal government to try and bring about change. So I highlight this to say that not only in the US, but in other parts of the world, moves for reparations are being articulated at the international, regional, national, and local levels. There still, I think, is a very big question on what reparations require and what they entail, not just as a legal remedy, but as a political and as a moral project. And when you look at international legal scholarship, and even when you look at international law, there is a tendency to do a number of things. One is to focus on the articles of state responsibility for international wrongful acts as the legal paradigm that should construct how we think about reparations. And in addition to the mobilization of that paradigm, there's an approach to reparations that locates colonialism in particular and even the transatlantic trade and enslaved Africans as events in the past where the harm of these events occurred in the past. And now what we're thinking about in terms of reparations is actually remedying those past harms. In an article that I'm working on, building on the work of many different scholars and activists, actually, scholars like Olufemi Taiwo, scholars like Sarah Riley Case, Julia Dem's co-author, and who both are drawing on anti-colonial traditions, Pan-African, anti-colonial, and broader traditions to argue that we should avoid conflating the project of reparations with this idea of remedying harm in the past. And also, we shouldn't restrict our demands for reparations to demands that can fit into the framework of the Articles of State Responsibility. So I want to be, before saying more about the approach that they advocate, I want to make clear that this is not to say that international law right now cannot sustain claims for reparations for colonial injustice. It absolutely can, and there are many examples, I think, of scholars and activists and other legal actors who are really pushing to say that within the existing international law, a lot more can be done than is already being done. But the point is instead to say that that's one piece of a much broader approach that really should see reparations as a world-making project. So with what we're talking about at the international level or the global level, is understanding that the project is about anti-colonial world making, and it is about undoing the structures of colonial injustice that are embedded in so many different levels and layers that thinking about past injustice isn't sufficient to solve the problem. This approach to reparations to thinking of reparations as world making, I think one of the benefits of it is that it understands colonialism as a structure that continues into the present. You know, I was listening to Julia's land acknowledgement, and I'm joining you from a settler colony. You are in a settler colony. An understanding of colonialism as a structure, I think, is of course one that is more salient, I think, when we think about settler colonial contexts. But even across the globe, the point is to say that colonialism and the injustices that it initiated remain embedded in legal, political, social, and other frameworks that are ongoing, and that racism and racial injustice in the present is actually one axis through which colonial racial injustice is reproduced. Whether you're thinking about land ownership and people's access to land and the ways in which in formerly colonized or ongoingly colonized context, land ownership remains racially stratified, we can think and should think about race and racism as being a structure through which colonial injustice is reproduced into the present. And so when you think about reparations as a world-making project, the idea here is that we are trying to undo the structures of injustice that persist into the present. And undoing those structures of injustice can't be siloed to the regime that we see in the Articles of State Responsibility, but actually involves the day-to-day practice and implementation of international law. So, for example, when we think about a case involving racial discrimination in the immigration context, that is a site for thinking about reparations because of the way that colonial injustice continues to structure the way that migration operates and also the way that racialization operates. And so even without thinking about the past, contemporary forms of racial injustice and remedying them is the project of reparations and implicates kind of the broad field of it. So um, that's, I mean, to speed up only because I want to leave time for questions, but I want to maybe end by talking about climate reparations and connecting them to the remarks that I've been making about thinking about reparations as a world-making project and rejecting a narrow conception of reparations that would have us think that what we're working on is historic injustice as a past event as opposed to an ongoing structure. My final report in my UN mandate was a report that really sought to make the argument that climate justice requires racial justice and that you cannot have the pursuit of climate justice or even climate reparations without addressing the racialized nature of both the causes of climate injustice, the effects and how they're experienced, and also the solutions that are going to be adopted to address climate injustice as well. And so that report is out, and I'm happy to talk about the process of putting it together and or anything else that is interesting or relevant to the group. But I would say that one thing that was surprising to me, and not surprising, well, it was unexpected, but should have not been surprising to me, is that in soliciting inputs for the report on climate justice and racial justice, I was really trying to think about connecting with movements and not just the people who are understood and labeled as climate experts within the UN system. For those of you who move within the UN system, you know that the way that expertise is understood in that context and in many others means that oftentimes the people who are producing the most sophisticated knowledge on a particular topic are excluded because they are not in elite institutions in the global north. And so their expertise is rendered kind of illegible in that context. But so the part of what was important to me and actually quite difficult was trying to have a call for submissions that would travel far and wide and solicit inputs that were relevant to the report. To come back to what was unexpected was that a lot of the most powerful work, I think, on climate reparations and racial justice is being done under different labels or categories or structures, right? So this is less I'm sharing this insight because I'm hoping it's something that you all will discuss over the course of the days that you are there, and maybe we might even talk about it in Q&A a little bit. But I think the framing of climate reparations is incredibly powerful, but that framing is also not necessarily the framing that the people who are doing the work of seeking climate reparations or fighting for climate reparations are using. You know, so if you have people who are working on land rights and are using legal frameworks where to mobilize the language of racial justice would be to undercut the claims, they will use they'll use what makes sense in their different local contexts. And to be able to have a transnational global conversation, there are terms and frames that we use to make that possible. But sometimes it's the very terms and phrases that then make it difficult to connect with and move forward the work that we are interested in. So that was something that I continue to think about as somebody who's invested both in reparations more broadly, but also climate reparations as well, as how do we do the work in ways that can connect us, but that don't render some groups invisible or make the work harder because of the new labeling. Finally, I will share that one of the groups that made submissions to my UN report, a group of Haitian social movement actors, produced a very exciting report on climate injustice in Haiti and making the case for reparations in Haiti in a very powerful way. And I share it because I think that they adopt what I've been describing and what other scholars have described as a world-making approach to reparations, and they make very powerfully the link between racial justice and climate injustice and very concrete demands on kind of what that would mean to move forward. So I'll put a link in the chat, even though Julie, I think maybe you said we mustn't use the chat. If not, I can email it to you.